Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to this week's Schiller Institute International webcast featuring our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. In the last days, the British have been in an open assault against Russia and Russian President Putin, using the Skripal case as the basis for that, with Theresa May going completely wild in trying to build a unified front against Russia and implicitly against President Trump's efforts to establish cooperative relationships between the United States and Russia. In the last days, this was completely outflanked by a call made between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. So we have lots to cover today, but I'd like to start there with the significance of the Trump-Putin discussion, Helga.
Well, I think this was a brilliant outflanking of this British operation because, just as Russiagate had vanished in the United States or almost collapsed and actually turned against the role of the British intelligence in this whole thing, this is the moment when Theresa May launched this absolutely incredible provocation against Russia. And, this was a clear effort to, basically push President Trump again in a corner where he would not dare to try to make good on his promise to improve relations with Russia. So by congratulating Putin for his re-election for another 6 years, and then, having very, very important discussions about the issues which are the real challenges in the world, namely, strategic stability, a prevention of the arms race, Syria, Ukraine, the Korea crisis. I think the two presidents established absolutely a direct connection and, make the British effort really look rather what it is, namely an absolutely insane provocation. Now, I think it's very important that in that same phone call, President Trump not only congratulated Putin for his re-election, but he also was very positive on the fact that President Xi Jinping, that the limit to his terms was eliminated so he can stay on in these crucial years ahead. And he said this is a very good thing because President Xi Jinping has provided very, very good leadership. I think the geopolitical faction is absolutely going bananas, and that is reflected in really hysterical media coverage about this. But I think it's a good thing, and the fact that if there is a relationship and a dialogue among the presidents of the three most important countries on the planet, the United States, Russia, and China, everybody who loves peace and who is not a moron should be happy about it. But if you contrast that with rather unbelievable warmongering of Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, for example, I mean, this guy, can you imagine? He said, because there was this poison attack on Skripal, a former double agent, that means the likelihood that Russia is throwing nuclear bombs. I mean, this is really crazy. I mean, the war fiction, they have gone beyond all reason. And Frau Merkel, the German chancellor, when she went to Poland, even went so far to say that Russia has to prove that they didn't do it. Can you imagine this? I mean, there is such a thing in international law as in dubio pro res, which means, in the doubt for the accused, and that the accuser has to provide the evidence and not the accused. And that's exactly what the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said. And he used that occasion to say that Merkel's behavior, unfortunately, points in the direction that the European leaders are not coming back to reason. So I think it's nothing can be expected from the Europeans at this point. The British are on a rampage. Merkel and Macron, for their own reasons, back this completely up. And therefore, I think it's very, very good that President Trump basically cut through all of this and established direct contact with Putin. And they announced that they will have a summit fairly soon between the two of them. Putin and Trump. And Serbia already offered Belgrade as a neutral place for the two to meet. So I think this is a very, very good sign.
And while this discussion was going on, there have been a number of other discussions that I think are quite significant between the US and Russian military, political leaders, a briefing at the Russian Foreign Ministry. It does appear as though the Trump administration and the Putin administration see this as an opportunity for outflanking it. Isn't that your assessment?
Yes, because, as you said, there were all kinds of other diplomatic initiatives. The two joint chiefs of staff communicated. Then there was a meeting between the Russian ambassador Antonov in the United Nations and Senator Rand Paul, which is very important because of all of this demonization. Almost nobody dared to speak with the Russian ambassador, like what happened to Sessions. So the two of them, Antonov and Rand Paul, also agreed to reestablish US-Russian interparliamentarian dialogue. So every effort to reestablish dialogue and trust building, confidence building is extremely welcomed, because as it had been developing, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, you had the idea of East policy, of rapprochement through cooperation, détente, trying to have a good neighbor relationship in Europe, and all of that with really, starting with the PNAC, the Doctrine for a New American Century, with the neocons at the turn of, when the Soviet Union collapsed. But that basically led to a complete build-up of a Cold War mentality, NATO expansion, regime change, interventionist wars. And this has poisoned the atmosphere so much that, you can really ask yourself, what was the purpose, or what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose when the British are trying to build such a war-like enemy image of Russia? Well, I mean, there are some very few lonely voices who share our view that once you build up such an enemy image and you poison the atmosphere, you completely make wild accusations. I mean, this is the kind of atmosphere in which things can go very quickly very wrong, and that would be devastating. Now, in this context, it's also noteworthy that there was a Senate Armed Service Committee hearing where the commander of the Strategic Command of the United States, General Heightening, was asked, do the United States at this point have any defense against the kinds of weapon systems which were announced by President Putin on the 1st of March? And he said no. Then his answer then was to say, therefore the use of low-yield nuclear weapons should be considered more strongly, which is in the new nuclear doctrine of the United States. And he was immediately refuted by a Democratic senator who said nobody should think that such so-called low-yield nuclear weapons use cannot immediately lead to an all-out nuclear weapon. So people should not be blind in repeating this Cold War demonization against Russia and in a certain sense against, because this is really dangerous. It's very dangerous, and you have the distinct feeling that, with the exception of such people as President Trump and a few others, that the present crop of politicians in leading positions have been so self-brainwashed and so incapable of strategic thinking, or even thinking the consequences of what they are saying and doing, that they are not capable to see the cause and effect of their warmongering. And I think we need a real discussion, that what is needed is cooperation, confidence building, dialogue, cooperation on economic projects, cooperation in space, which was also mentioned in this context as a positive step. But we have to have a debate that, this kind of confrontation should stop, and we should support President Trump when he is trying to mend fences with Russia and China and not attack him.
And there is a counterattack against May from within the United Kingdom, from Jeremy Corbyn, even from some of the people in the chemical weapons section of British intelligence. Will this backfire, this whole effort to turn this against Russia? Will this backfire, Helga?
Well, I think it shows like never before, the role of the British. And I think that is a useful thing, because those among our audience who know the LaRouche movement for a longer time will remember that we were always, and especially my husband was always attacked, that he pointed to the role of the British, that it was the British Empire, which still exists, not in the old form, but it exists in the form of the leading financial institutions and, their whole system of, private security firms and, the whole central bank insurance company system. The transatlantic financial structure is the present form of the British Empire. And my husband always pointed to the fact that it is that which is corrupting the United States and, running much of the dope traffic. And he always was accused that he, said the British monarchy is behind all of this. Now, I mean, anybody who looks at the present manipulation of the situation can see very clearly the role of the British, the role of Boris Johnson, the role of Theresa May, who just are the instruments of this. But I think this is very useful because, the real United States, after all, made an American Revolution and a war of independence against this British Empire. And if you look at the history, that same British Empire never gave up the idea of reconquering the United States. And finally, they succeeded to establish this special relationship between the United States and Great Britain to run the world as an unipolar world. And if President Trump breaks out of that, and that was the real reason for the attacks on him, and establishes a direct communication with Russia and China, then that's the end of this kind of geopolitical manipulation of divide and conquer of the world. And that is a very good thing. And I think that should happen right now.
Well, and when we talk about backfiring, this calls to mind something you often bring up, the Schiller's idea of the Ibycus principle. We see it also with Russiagate, the firing of McCabe in the last days, the focus now on John Brennan. There are a whole series of articles attacking John Brennan, who's coming out openly saying Trump is crazy and has to be removed. And then there's the whole story that the attempt to ensnare Trump in this Cambridge Analytica. And there's a whole different story that's now coming out on this. This is the Ibycus principle, isn't it?
Yes. And I think it's also very useful because, we always warned against the addiction of young people to the so-called social media. Where the real life, real friendships, real studying, real discussions were replaced by this almost autistic dependency on the so-called social media, which is a virtual reality. So-called friends are no friends, and now it turns out that this whole thing was just a commercial operation to collect private data, sell them for commercial and other interests. And I think it's a very useful thing. Interesting in this context is also a comment by Edward Snowden, who said, a firm which collects and sells private data should be rightly called a surveillance institution. And to call that social media is the most successful fraud, since the story that the war ministry is really a defense ministry was sold officially to the public. So I think this whole affair should lead to a rethinking. What do you do with this surveillance apparatus, and how do you trust this, and how you demand especially the re-establishment of privacy control, or control of private data and forcing governments and legislators to go back to a protection of the private sphere of the citizens. I think the idea that everything is transparent and everything is, allowed for everybody to be manipulated, it's really part of, giving up your individual freedom and, being completely controlled, profiled, shaped, nudged into any direction. I think people should reflect all of this and not be so absolutely naive. And I think this Cambridge Analytica story and the role of Facebook is a very useful reminder to think about these matters in a different way.
Well, then you have the other whole irony of the efforts to pin Press Secretary Sanders down on why didn't Trump talk about the fraud in the Russian elections? And she made the comment, well, we're not in the business of telling other countries how to run elections. But it does seem as though we completely, by we, I mean the United States government, constantly talks about Russian interference in private lives, when what Snowden showed and Clapper tried to lie to cover it up is that the biggest violator of that is the National Security Agency. Now, on the Ibicus principle, Helga, I don't know if we have enough on this yet for you to say much, but it should be noted that former French President Nicolas Sarkozy was arrested, I believe yesterday, one day after the 7th anniversary of his role in working together with Cameron, former British Prime Minister, and also with Obama and Hillary Clinton to destroy Libya and kill Gaddafi. Do you have anything on that story?
Well, I have to see what our French colleagues are actually saying about that. But I can tell you that much, that the story is breaking big time in Italy, where many former politicians are now commenting on it by saying, that it was a big mistake for Italy to be drawn into this war, basically by the British, by Hillary Clinton, who then convinced NATO and then drew in Italy to join in this attack. And, that they should have talked more to Germany at the time. Germany at the time, the foreign minister was Guido Westerwelle, who fortunately, opposed to be part of this. But what these Italian politicians are pointing to, that, if the story is what the accusations are right now, which obviously needs to be determined, that Sarkozy did receive large money from Gaddafi. The son of Gaddafi and a former advisor of Gaddafi have now testified that Sarkozy would have handed 50 million for his election campaign. Gaddafi then only would have given him 20 million. But that then Sarkozy basically later, I mean, that's what the Italian media are saying right now, and some politicians made a personal warfare against Gaddafi to eliminate a witness. If that is true, it would be really an incredible story. And these Italian politicians, former deputy secretary of defense, for example, say that this war has led to a complete destruction of Libya, terrible economic, social, and humanitarian catastrophes erupting out of that. I mean, the whole Libyan state is still completely torn apart and part of the refugee crisis. And naturally, the impact of that on Italy in terms of the refugees, in terms of energy supplies and so forth, was quite devastating. But I think this is just one more symptom of many, because if you look at what has come out in terms of the political class, the class of managers, the academia, I mean, there has never been such an open, disgrace of so many of representatives of this so-called elite and establishment, that I think it is a very serious problem we have in the West. And the reason why in Europe, for example, some of these right-wing populist parties are coming up is because of that. And right now you have a complete collapse and disappearance of the so-called people's parties, and they're being replaced by populist movements or extreme right-wing movements. And I think it's a reflection of a real moral crisis of the West. And that's why we need a change. We need a new paradigm, and we need to call on you, the audience, the viewership, to help us and enter with us a discourse. Where should our future be, and why we need a new paradigm?
Well, and let's move now from this discussion of the corruption of the establishment in the West. And we should just remind listeners that Hillary Clinton played a big role in the Libya operation. And this was one of the points that President Trump focused on when he said that his administration would stop regime change policies. But let's move to something much more positive. You brought up the new paradigm. President Xi Jinping just gave a closing speech at the Two Sessions conference in China, in which he discussed reiterated the long-term goals for China in his presidency. And I'd like your thoughts on what he had to say.
Well, he, first of all, emphasized both humility and pride. He said the purpose of leadership is to serve the people. And he repeated that many times, and thanked the Chinese population for having the confidence in him to, continue his leadership. And naturally, the Western media was completely freaked out about, Xi Jinping being now in the leadership position in the next period, in the next years, with an indefinite time interval. But, from a Chinese standpoint, Xi Jinping has proven to be an exceptional leader. And he said, this is going to be a very difficult period for China because it takes place in a very complex world situation. And he indeed called for a new long march. And, this is quite an amazing historic reference to the history of China. So I think, he is clearly somebody who is devoted to the common good of the Chinese people. And, the contrast to what China is actually doing and how the Chinese people are happy to have such a leader, as the Russian people are happy to have Putin. I mean, after all, 76% vote for Putin is more than the West for sure expected. And I find a little joke very funny, saying that, Putin won the election and the Russians did it. Anyway, I find this amusing with all of this Russia bashing, that the Russians are behind anything. So I think we have a situation where, Russia is clearly responding to Putin's leadership. China is clearly devoted to continue on the course of the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. Many more countries joining in, and even Morgan Stanley, one of the Wall Street banks, put out a report saying this is the largest infrastructure project in history, and it will continue. It will make China a very strong modern economy with wealthy inhabitants, and all the countries who join will have the same. And they say that the AIIB is estimating that there is an infrastructure financing gap of something like $21 trillion. And obviously, this is a gigantic task to be accomplished, because the previous leading financial institutions of the West, the IMF and the World Bank, they did not give that kind of development credit, and therefore China is doing something for the uplifting of the developing countries, which is actually priceless, because for the first time these countries have the chance to overcome their situation, which was really terrible. And I think it's very good, because the new Silk Road spirit is something which, once people understand it, that it's based on the idea of a harmonious development of all, of working together to the mutual benefit. Naturally, China is pursuing its interests, but all the other countries are happy that for the first time somebody is taking care of their interest as well. So I think, the whole propaganda about China is really that what it is. It's propaganda coming from geopolitical warmongering people in the West. And we should build a mass movement of people who say, no, we should take up the offer of Xi Jinping and have a win-win cooperation, join the new Silk Road projects. And there are plenty of tasks where we can have a common destiny of mankind. And Xi Jinping, in this speech, he used a very beautiful idea, let the sun shine on the shared community for the one future of humanity, and basically make it illuminous.
In contrast to the positive report from Morgan Stanley on China, we saw one of the chief market economists for Goldman Sachs, a man named Himmelberg, warning of the financial fragility in the West, especially if liquidity flows are cut. And of course, yesterday, the Federal Reserve Board met and said they're going to cut liquidity flows by raising interest rates another 3 to 5 times over the next 12 months. So I think we can see the contrast very clearly. Now, one of the other areas where a contrast comes in is that in spite of the threats coming from the anti-China lobby in the United States about the danger of China becoming a hegemonic power, we see developments that continue to be positive on the Korean Peninsula, which include collaboration between President Trump and Xi Jinping. There's a couple of summits that were announced, and Helga, it looks as though this is just going to continue to build toward the possibility of an outbreak of peace. How horrible, huh?
Yeah, I mean, the possibility that it comes to a trilateral summit in May between Trump, Kim Jong-un, and President Moon from South Korea is right now very likely. Also, there will be other summits involving Japan, Russia. So I think there is a strategic realignment. And, I really think that the countries who are stubbornly insisting on the geopolitical confrontation, they will be sidelined. I mean, I'm not underestimating the danger, as we can see by the British behavior, but I think the overwhelming tendency is really development and cooperation. And, this is a very good thing. Let me just mention one last point on this contrast. While China is cooperating with many African nations, building railways, we talked about the beautiful Transaqua project, which is now on the table. And this is, bringing the Silk Road spirit into Africa. Now, what is the EU doing? They just had a African Union EU summit in Kigali, in Rwanda, where only 25 African countries participated, and notably absent was President Buhari of Nigeria, who refused to go and does not want to have Nigeria to sign the proposed free trade agreement between the AU and the EU. Why? Because, naturally, many of the industries of African nations are still in their infant condition, very, backward or not developed and fragile. And naturally, if you have a free trade agreement, then all the European products would just flood the African markets even more than they do already. And that way absolutely prevent and strangulate the young emerging industries in the African nations. And therefore, some of the Africans just refuse it. But the reason why I'm mentioning it is because it just shows you that the neoliberal, neocon geopolitical system is really not out for win-win. They want to exploit their advantages. And, that the EU is doing that is really one more reason to say that they represent a system which is not in the interest of anybody they cooperate with, nor their own members. And if you want to know the proof of that, just look at the Southern European countries who have been completely smashed by the austerity policy of the Troika. I think that what we need instead is exactly what Italy is now doing, working with China and the African nations in building up real economic development like the Transaqua project. So I think we have a real, very crystal clear picture where you see the intention of the two paradigms, the old paradigm of neoliberal control of the world and the new paradigm of harmonious development of all nations. And I think people should really help that the second one becomes the victorious one and join with us.
And Helga, when you talk about being stuck in the old paradigm, do you have anything to say about the new appointments to the new German government?
Yeah, that is a very sad story. As for Mrs. Merkel, who had nothing better to do than to be the puppy dog of the British, really, this is a disgrace, which should be understood and noted by everybody. But also the SPD, who is in a deep crisis, they have been falling in the polls to, less than 15%. The new finance minister, Scholz, what did he do? He appointed a banker from Goldman Sachs, Jörg Kukis, to be the deputy finance minister. And that has caused a revolt in the German population. There was a poll whereby 64.9% of the people thought this was disgusting. And then he also appointed another guy called Kastner, who is known to be the architect of the Black Zero policy of Schäuble. And then Scholz said, oh, he's so happy that he was able to put together a good team. Now that forebodes not good things for Germany, because as everybody knows, we are on the verge of a new financial crash. This was again mentioned by Sheila Baer, rather, the former head of the FDIC in the United States, who warned that the absolutely continuation of the derivative trade, the speculative excesses, the non-correction of the reasons which led to the 2008 crisis now means we are in absolute danger of a new, even bigger crash. And she contrasted that, by the way, very much with what China has been doing by trying to completely forbid speculative investments, by stabilizing the banking sector, by increasing the reserves of the banks to 15%. But, if you have such a, pro bubble government in Germany, this is not good. And, also, despite the fact that there are many Italian politicians from the Lega and the Five Star Party who are calling for Glass-Steagall, the EU is trying to get a Five-Star Democratic Party government, which would be, from their standpoint, the optimal option to preserve this speculative system. So, I'm saying this because the Damocles sword of a new financial crash is absolutely still hanging over the world. All I can say is, given the fact that China has consciously tried to move its financial system into safe waters, they are probably better protected against the effects of such a crisis coming than anybody else. And I would ask for viewership, you join with us, join with the Schiller Institute to try to help to mobilize for the 4 laws proposed by my husband, Glass-Steagall: a return to Hamiltonian banking, credit system, national bank, crash program for thermonuclear fusion research and power and space cooperation, and then join with the new Silk Road countries. And we could have a new paradigm in the world very, very quickly. But it requires you, and it requires people to become active and not leave the events and the history of mankind in the hands of an obviously corrupt establishment.
Well, and Helga, I think we can conclude by coming to the commemoration of an event which proved that cynics are not right, that people who say you can't change the world with big ideas. 35 years ago from tomorrow, March 23rd, 1983, there was a shock effect around the world when Ronald Reagan gave a primetime speech. And at the end of that speech, he endorsed the policy that your husband first introduced with his pamphlet Sputnik of the 80s in the late 1970s. That is the Strategic Defense Initiative. And it's especially relevant today, given what we're seeing from Russia and President Putin. So I'd like your reflections on the importance of this anniversary of this event from 35 years ago.
Well, I think that the SDI proposal, which was absolutely not what the media made out of it, calling it Star Wars and things like that. The SDI proposal of my husband was an absolutely far-sighted vision of a new paradigm. And if you read the relevant papers about it, especially a proposed draft for a dialogue among the superpowers, which was published 1 year later, which you can find in the archive or even in the newer EIRs. This was a vision where both superpowers would develop together new physical principles, which would make nuclear weapons obsolete. And I think what Putin announced on the 1st of March in terms of new physical principles applied for new weapon systems is absolutely in this tradition. And Putin also asked, now they have to sit down and we have to negotiate and put together a new security architecture, including Russia, the United States, China, and the Europeans. This was all envisioned by my husband in this famous SDI proposal. And it was a very far-reaching idea to dissolve the blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, to cooperate instead among sovereign republics, which is exactly what the new Silk Road dynamic today represents. And it was also the idea to use a science driver in the economy, to use the increased productivity of the real economy for a gigantic technology transfer to the developing sector in order to overcome their underdevelopment and poverty. And this is what we are seeing today also in the collaboration between China, Russia, and the countries who are participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think, in a certain sense, it's part of this danger of peace breaking out, that there is right now the very vivid tradition and actualization of that tradition of the SDI. And I think we should circulate this proposal by my husband again. I think we should enlarge it to become the SDE, the Strategic Defense of the Earth, because, it was just discovered that very soon another big asteroid will take course on, or is already taking a course on the planet Earth. So we need to move quickly to the common aims of mankind, and all countries should cooperate and be a shared community for the one future of humanity. I mean, this is the new paradigm, which I think is so obvious. I mean, if you look at the long arch of history, we have to overcome geopolitics and we have to move to a kind of cooperation where we put all our forces together to solve those questions which are a challenge to all of humanity. And, nuclear weapons, poverty, asteroids. I mean, there's so many areas where we could fruitfully cooperate. Space exploration is one of them. And, I think we are in a very fascinating moment in history, but we need more active citizens. So please contact us, work with us, and let's together make a better world.
And I think that's a very good place to end. People should now realize that giving up your pessimism is one of the keys to bringing online this new paradigm. So Helga, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, see you next week.